Well, good morning. My name's Matt, Director of Cybersecurity Strategy at Proofpoint. We're going to talk about imposters, the threat of imposter fraud that we're all dealing with. Some people call it business email compromise, imposter fraud, all the challenges that kind of surround that. We'll walk through some of those challenges, how they're evolving a little bit, and then hopefully kind of towards the end, we'll talk about what we can do about it, how we can address the risk, how we can minimize the risk as we go through. Anyone ever played the video game Among Us? Yeah, it's super cool. I love this game. The whole premise of this game is that a bunch of online people are thrown into a spaceship and they have to do a bunch of tasks in order to keep the spaceship operational. Things like fixing the wiring, making sure the nuclear reactor doesn't melt down, everyday sort of tasks that we kind of normally do. But one of those crewmates has been assigned the role of imposter, and it's their job to sabotage the tasks and actually do away with some of their crewmates as they go along. And their job is to stay hidden, right? Get to the end of the game, still alive, nobody knows you're an imposter, nobody knows that you've killed all the other crewmates and they're all lying on the floor around you and nobody's worked it out. And that role of imposter, I kind of drew some analogies with the workplace, believe it or not. When you think about imposters, we're not necessarily all sat there in the workplace with eggs on our heads running around trying to do away with our colleagues, but what we are doing is having to deal with digital communication, talking to people on a regular basis and making an assumption that they are who they say they are. That when you get an email from Matt at Proofpoint, that actually you trust Matt at Proofpoint, right? Because you met Matt at Proofpoint at this event. And so when Matt at Proofpoint emails you, you know you're talking to Matt at Proofpoint because it says it on the email address. The thing is, you might be a bit skeptical about that. We're cybersecurity professionals, right? So we understand that we're not necessarily talking to the person we think we are. We know imposter fraud exists out there, but your employees are kind of a little bit different. They build up a trust in relationship, and as humans, we're built to create these relationships. We're built actually to take rewards from the levels of trust that we put into those relationships. And when those relationships work out and when good things happen, we feel good about that. And so all of your employees, your colleagues are not necessarily looking at digital communication the same way. They're not necessarily looking at that email when it arrives to say, actually, that might not be Matt at Proofpoint. That instruction that I've got to send the money into this particular bank account instead might not be the correct one. And so, because we're built on relationships, because we're built on trust, because that's how we operate, cyber criminals, of course, know that. And cyber criminals are clearly looking to exploit that. And which, they of course are doing. And they're not just doing it in the workplace, but they're also doing it in our daily lives. Now this is kind of interesting. This is something that cropped up actually on the BBC website. I threw this in. It came up last week. I don't sit at home all day watching BBC Morning Live. That's not how I spotted this. But they did a really interesting piece on a WhatsApp scam. And it's a scam that's been around for ages. But for me, it kind of does a really, really good job to explain to employees, to explain to colleagues what the problem of imposter fraud actually is. And the whole idea of this scam is we all use, I'm taking a guess that a lot of us are using WhatsApp. A lot of us are in various different groups. You might have a group for the running club, you might have a group for the school, class, whatever it happens to be. Some of you might even be using it in the workplace as well for communications. And those groups have invite links, and often those invite links get shared online. And of course, cyber criminals, to see an opportunity, right, I'll sign up to that group. Cyber criminal joins running club group through the link because that link was shared on social media and it was public and everyone gets it. And of course, they're in that group. And of course, what they do at that point is just sit around, change their profile picture so that they're looking like they're wearing a fluorescent running t-shirt and everything's looking good. And then at some point, someone in the group will get a voice message or a phone call saying, hey, that chat we were having about this particular event? Well, we're setting up a private subgroup in order to talk about that. I'm going to invite you to that subgroup. And that person's looking at the message thinking, okay, that's come from Matt within the running club. Okay, it must be legit, that's fine. And at that point, the person's saying, well, in order to get you in the group, I'm going to send you a code. You let me know what the code is, and then I'll get you into the group added and we can chat about that new running event, that 10K that we've got coming up. And of course, what they're doing at that point is registering the account on a different device. An account takeover has just happened. And so the criminal at that point, the cyber criminal has access to all of your contacts and all of your conversations. And of course, the worst then can happen because, again, that person's now got a level of trust. Because in your WhatsApp, you're communicating with a whole bunch of different people, including your mum, your wife, and everybody else in there. And all of a sudden, Julie in the running club then gets a message from you to say, hey, I'm in a bit of a pickle. It's my sister's birthday. I need to get her a present, but I'm traveling for work. Can you do me a favor and just quickly send £100 into this PayPal account so that I can sort it out whilst I'm traveling for her? And that's how the scam plays out. And of course, from there, further compromise will happen, right? Other people will get contacted and away it goes from there. Now, the reason I'm explaining this is not because WhatsApp's overly relevant, and this type of scam you might be thinking is not overly relevant to the workplace, but it plays out on email in almost exactly the same way. That level of trust that we build into our communication, regardless of whether it's WhatsApp, text messages or emails, whatever it happens to be, is always there, because we make an assumption based on the identity when the message comes through that that's Matt from the running club, or that's Matt from Proofpoint from the email address. And that's the assumption that people are making, and that's what obviously the criminals are looking to exploit. And obviously the problem here is we lead to account takeover. And if we've got account takeover, a criminal's got the account, well, bad things are going to happen from there, right? You can imagine how within an organization that would then, the scam would play out and it would roll forward. Now, you're probably thinking, and a lot of organizations do say, hey, it's okay, Matt, we've got multi-factor authentication on our accounts. We won't get compromised in that way. Yeah, we should probably talk about that, because about 89% of UK security professionals that we surveyed still believe that multi-factor authentication provides complete protection against account takeover through phishing. The 1 million plus phishing threats that we see using adversary in the middle type tactics like the evil proxy toolkits, we see about 1 million plus a month, would suggest differently. Because right now, what the criminals are doing is ultimately, they're just standing up a reverse proxy. They don't necessarily even need to build a phishing website that looks like your company's login page anymore. But if you're using one login, or you're using Office 365 or Okta, whatever it is you're using to log in, it doesn't matter anymore. Because they'll just throw up a reverse proxy. Build the phishing, send the phishing emails out, click on the link, people will see the web page, it's the right one because it's being proxied through, username, password, multi-factor authentication entered at that point. Obviously, criminals then got the account details. Yeah, they've got the MFA token, but that's kind of irrelevant because it'll expire in a minute. But what they get is the session cookie. And of course, if they've got the session cookie, they've ultimately got access to the account at that point. And account takeover has then happened. So account takeover is ripe through phishing right now. And that is a real challenge that organizations are dealing with. And that's ultimately can be devastating for us, and as we've already highlighted, the trust in our identities, of course, then will be used to exploit those that we communicate with onwards from there. And to make matters worse, I think it was a couple of weeks ago, the Verizon data breach report came out. I'm sure a bunch of you took away some of the highlights from that, but that one thing that I took away was that it told us that the average time for a user to fall for a phishing attack is less than 60 seconds. So 60 seconds from clicking to submission of credentials, and away we go. So 60 seconds till account compromise, ultimately. Add on to that some of our own research from all the data that we see at Proofpoint, and it shows us that nearly 1 in 7 malicious URL clicks happen within 1 minute of the email's arrival. So not just 60 seconds from when you click on the link, but actually just 1 minute from when the message actually lands in the inbox. Because again, the way we all work, message pops up on a desktop. If we're going to interact with it, we're going to pretty much do it straight away. We're going to do that triage, either delete it or move on, or we're going to interact with it and click on it and away we go and log in. So the problem here is if the messages get as far as the inbox, we've got a real account takeover challenge that we have to deal with. Okay, so we know how accounts might get compromised, but that's our own accounts. What if somebody else's accounts got compromised? What if the organization that, I don't know, one of your suppliers, an organization that you do business with, that you communicate with on a regular basis, that you have a big business relationship with, from your company to theirs, what if one of their accounts get popped? Because your security and your defenses are great, but what about theirs? So if one of theirs gets compromised, how do we deal with that? Because there we're back to trust again. When the email comes in from somebody that we've probably emailed before, from a company that we already know, that we've got an existing conversation chain with, the level of trust in communication is already there. And so we make assumptions as humans thinking, this is good, this is my relationship with Matt in Proofpoint, this is gonna work. I can do what he's asking me to do and everything's gonna feel good for me after we've completed this interaction. Well, scams play out, and I don't doubt that people in here have probably experienced scams exactly like this, but this is one example of supplier invoicing fraud, wherein a supplier to an organisation, an account had become compromised. The attacker was essentially looking at the outbox, looking at the sent items, and can see at that point that actually this is someone in accounts sending invoice reminders. And they see the invoice reminder go through. And they just sat there watching and think, right, there's the opportunity. The message is already there. The conversation thread's set up. It's asking for payment. It's got information in there. The attacker, of course, that has compromised the account can then do a reply all on exactly that thread, as if it were that person that were compromised, and say, hey, actually, in this case, our bank account's under audit. We need you to send the money to a different place. Is that okay? Just for this short period of time whilst that's going on, we need inbound payments to go somewhere else. Now, of course, the attacker sent that from that supplier's infrastructure, so the message has gone in the inbox. So, of course, the sent items, and they very quickly click on that and delete the item to evade detection. The recipient over at your company is looking at it, sees the message come through, starts to look at the message and think, okay, they're asking for a different bank account, looks at the bank account information, and actually we see examples where attackers go as far as actually establishing bank accounts with the same sort code, very similar bank account numbers to the originals. And there was one really, really big scam that played out actually in the world of football transfers that took place. And payments for players that happened, very large sums of money. But the scammer was running exactly like this, but what they actually did was set a bank account up at exactly the same branch. And the bank account number, the digits, just changed by 1. And so the recipient's looking at that, and of course they're going to trust that, right? Now, of course, the level of effort that an attacker goes to is kind of matches the amount of reward that they're going to get. You know, in the case of this one, this is a supplier invoicing fraud. We're talking probably about tens of thousands. We see these types of scams playing out at the really small level in the tens of pounds to the tens of thousands, like in this case for supplier invoices, up to the hundreds of thousands and the millions when we're talking about mergers and acquisitions, if that's the topic of conversation that's going on. And so the level of risk, or your exposure to risk, obviously varies. But you know, what they'll also do is look for other ways to continue persistence in the conversation. They're not going to rely on just sending this different bank account details and deleting the message from the outbox. What they want to do is carry on the conversation with you so that it still happens. And so they'll probably do things like add in a separate reply to address. And that reply to address will be to the person that's compromised name, but it'll be routing to a different domain somewhere else. So ultimately then the conversation is actually not going between your company and the exposed company, it's actually going directly to the attacker, to their infrastructure. And of course then they can establish persistence in that conversation, keep the scam playing out without being detected within your infrastructure, or within the supplier's infrastructure at that point. So it's a challenge. Now, as I said, the level of effort that the attackers will put in will vary based on what the reward is. If it's a hot scam and ultimately they can see a big reward and a big payout, they will throw a lot of resources at it. So how do we fix it? How can we solve the problem? Well, clearly there's no silver bullet in security, we know that, but there are a few basics that we can be doing. In the way in our industry, we always talk about making sure our patches are up to date, making sure we're not exposed to some vulnerabilities. Those are the basics. DMARC should be one of the basics. 53% of the FTSE 100 in the UK have not deployed DMARC at reject. Now DMARC, if you're not at DMARC reject for your domains, you actually don't need to worry about your accounts being compromised, because attackers can ultimately just spoof your domains and send emails to the companies that you do business with and pretend to be you anyway. And so for the attackers, it's significantly easy for them in order to establish that conversation and to use your domain as that level of trust in that communication path. So we need to think about that. Think about that as one of the basics. If you're not absolutely doing it right now, then we really should be looking at, and again, not just quarantine or getting to just having a DMARC record in place. Yeah, okay, it helps, but if it's not at reject, honestly, there is very little point at just sitting there forever at quarantine. I think the other thing to consider is your business relationships. We see a lot of organizations now that start to actually write into their supplier contracts that you need to have deployed DMARC if you're going to communicate with us. That's becoming more and more common. Because if you think about that, is it okay in 2024 to accept business instructions about making bank payments from an email chain that isn't authenticated, that we don't know for sure is actually even coming from that supplier, that could be coming from anywhere else? And that's the reality of not having DMARC at reject. So that's one of the basics. Hopefully that's an easy one that we can all do. One of the next basics is focusing on your people, because ultimately it's people that are vulnerable here to it. We can do everything we can with technology, and we'll talk about how we can keep some of this away from people, but the people themselves need to be armed with the risks. And if we do nothing for our people other than just share them that link to the BBC that I gave you earlier on, I actually think that would be massively helpful. And one of the things we find in security awareness training is actually if we put more effort into helping people become more cyber secure and aware in their home lives and their personal lives, that transfers to the workplace really, really simply. And it has some real positive impacts because they feel like they're getting something more out of it. What we also know is that one-size-fits-all security awareness training does not work. If you've got once a year checkbox compliance-based exercises, it doesn't lead to cultural change. It doesn't lead to a greater level of understanding in people. We need to be thinking about how we can take that up to the next level. You know, as an example, within Proofpoint, one of the areas that we focus on is actually taking all of the threat intelligence that we can learn from your email channels coming through. So all those emails that get thrown away and they'll get rejected because they're rubbish, well, they've got rejected for a reason, right? It's a scam. It could be one of those supplier invoicing scams. Maybe it's emails that are being sent to Matt in the finance department saying, hey, you need to transfer the money to a different place. Well, if those are all being rejected at the gateway, that's all useful information, because that immediately tells us that actually right now, Matt in finance is being targeted with business email compromise attacks. Now, we can't make an assumption that everything is going to get blocked. We need to assume that some stuff is going to get through. So maybe the right time to train Matt actually is when we see the risk levels go up. Now, of course, if we can combine that with my level of knowledge and my level of security awareness to say, actually, Matt kind of regularly fails on phishing simulation scams and clicks on those links as well. Well, now we know that Matt is not only being targeted, that Matt's also vulnerable. Andy works in the finance department, so he's got privilege and access to money. So he's vulnerable, he's targeted, and he's attacked and he's privileged. Essentially, he's a VAP at that point. If we can then roll that into our security awareness training, it allows us to then do the right training at the right time for the right people. So we don't have to do one size fits all. And if we can then mold the content to make it super, super relevant, because we know that Matt's in this age demographic, he travels to work on a scooter, he does this. If we have the extra levels of understanding, we can make it so much more interesting for people rather than going, next finish on that once a year security awareness training. Anyway, jumping back to compromised supplier accounts, a couple of other interesting metrics from all the data that we see within Proofpoint. 80% of our customers receive an attack from a compromised supplier account every single month. So 80%, that's huge. So that kind of gives you an idea of the scale of the problem we're dealing with. And more interestingly, something that came out of, I think it was IBM's cost of data breach report, the average dwell time for a compromised account was 233 days. So when an account does become compromised, it won't necessarily get used. We said about accounts getting compromised within a minute, within 60 seconds. It's not going to get used straight away. The attackers are probably going to leave that. And in fact, they might even farm that account and sell the access and privilege onto another crime group in order to operate, for the scam to play out. Or they'll just sit there waiting until the time is right. Because like us, cyber criminals have got other things to do. They've got other jobs, other accounts, other scams that they're playing out. So they'll come back to it when they're ready. So the dwell time is particularly important. So a lot of our focus, as well as needing to be on the people and educating people and doing the basics of security right, also needs to be on the content of the messages coming through. Because one of the big challenges with account takeover, with account compromise, ultimately is the message that comes through is fine. It looks all right. There's nothing wrong with it. It comes from Matt at Proofpoint. Matt at Proofpoint emailed me yesterday asking me about what happened at the weekend in the football. this is a valid message. So how do we determine whether it's legit, ultimately? And one of the big innovations that's kind of come out of Proofpoint recently is around our pre-delivery, I have to be careful how I use this word, semantic analysis. I didn't say semantic analysis, I didn't. Large language model detection engines. And we're doing it pre-delivery. Now, this is kind of a bit of an industry first, because over the last few years, a lot of organizations have actually been looking to kind of bolt something a bit like this on the back end of Microsoft 365 through APIs, which is kind of great if everything works really, really quickly, if everything actually works within that 60 seconds. The real value is if we can keep it out of the inbox in the first place, we can do all this up front. And so now we've built that in directly into the infrastructure using those large language models to be able to do things like say, yeah, this is a conversation that's changed its tone, that all of a sudden now we're getting urgency being applied to it. Hey, Matt, you really need to make that payment. The bank details have changed since the last time it came through. Matt doesn't normally use a PDF invoice that has been signed by a different CA. All of those are different indicators, right? If we can build up a knowledge of those indicators, then we can provide, well, we can make decisions and say, actually, we'll stop it before it even gets as far as the inbox. Or before it gets to the inbox, we'll put a little banner on it, a little context-aware notification, a nudge, if you like, for the user to say, hey, actually, just pay a little bit more attention to those emails that are coming through from that. Now, that's fine for the emails when they come through, but what can we do if the emails are not coming through? Is there a way that we can actually know that these compromised accounts are going to start communicating with my employees before they even start communicating with my employees? Well, believe it or not, there actually is, because I talked about some of the data that we have within Proofpoint. You know, we see data and communication patterns across about 500,000 customers. So we see the vast majority of the world's corporate email flowing through our infrastructure. That allows us to see behavior changes. If we start to get indicators that say, hey, actually, you know, you deal with that company that makes those widgets and supplies those widgets on a regular basis, well, within the Proofpoint infrastructure, we can see that the account that regularly emails someone in your finance, well, their behavior has changed. That all of a sudden they've started sending out emails to numerous people, or all of a sudden perhaps they've started changing the tone and the language that they're using in those emails as well. Those kind of all give us indicators. And so one of the features that we can now introduce to our clients is to say, actually, we can tell you that if we suspect that Matt in the finance department at the widget company has become compromised. If we suspect that, then you can determine how you treat the emails that they come through. So when the attacker's focus then changes to your finance department, then at that point those emails perhaps can be tagged to say, hey, we think this account might be compromised, or we think this conversation may be suspicious. Please pay a little bit more attention to it before you transfer the money or do whatever it is that you happen to do. And so again, it's using that vast sort of threat intelligence ultimately that we have that comes from the world's email chain to effectively help you better defend your organization. Now, the reality of the email security market right now is that there is a lot of fragmentation, and you know, I kind of alluded to this a little bit. Many of us are using cloud email environments like Office 365 and have decided we've had to bolt something onto the back end of it as well. And one of the challenges that organizations have ultimately is the speed of that detection, is actually the fact that they're letting threats land in the user's inbox before they go in and do something about it. And that really is a challenge. So our focus within Proofpoint is very much kind of redefining, if you like, what email security is actually talking more about, yes, pre-delivery, post-delivery, and click time protection, kind of all wrapped in together. And each one needs to talk to each other. Because if a message has got through, for whatever reason, maybe it was a compromised account that didn't get detected. Maybe it was a URL that was later changed to malicious in a phishing link, and the status changed on it. If we learn about that at post-delivery, we of course then can feed that intelligence back round to pre-delivery as well, so that future ones don't come in. But post-delivery actually allows us to then go in and remediate and say, actually, you're exposed. We've detected from another customer that this email ultimately has turned malicious. We can see that 5 of your users have seen it. We can see that 2 of them clicked on the link and have interacted with it. And not only can we go in and remove that email, it's ultimately share that intelligence with the rest of the ecosystem to say, hey, maybe Microsoft Defender, you want to isolate that endpoint because we can see that someone clicked on the link and we know that they perhaps downloaded some malware at that point or whatever it happens to be. So sharing the intelligence, whether it's with the endpoint, whether it's with the firewalls, whether it's with authentication, that just lets people, applies more stringent controls on them at that point. So again, it's effectively opening up that ecosystem. It's opening up the intelligence, it's opening up the data and everything that we have. And so we bring that all together at Proofpoint under what we call kind of human-centric security. The objective ultimately is to help solve the challenges that you're facing right now, and imposter threats is probably one of the biggest ones that we hear about. And I actually think that one of the big reasons that we hear about it is because a lot of people have taken the choice that they're actually just going to rely on Microsoft alone. And what they're starting to realize is that not everything is getting blocked. A lot of these types of threats are coming through. Obviously, it's one of the areas that we can help you with. We're here today to kind of talk to you a lot more about that. If you'd like to have more conversations, please give us a shout. If you've got any challenges with imposter threats as well, I'll be interested to hear any stories that you've got around that because they're always good to know. But I hope that was useful. If anyone has any questions, I'll be happy to take some now as well.
Do you have any numbers on reverse proxy attacks? How many of them are in general successful? Because in them, even if you have a reverse proxy, you need to have a lookalike domain or something like that.
Yeah, you do. I mean, so even if you stand up that reverse proxy, yeah, you're right. Having lookalike domains, you need to be able to spot those lookalike domains. And one of the big challenges that we see is actually a lot of those reverse proxies are getting stood up in infrastructure that people are using. And so the URLs that point to them, well, they might not necessarily be familiar, but they'll be comfortable with. In other words, they're being hosted in Microsoft Azure or they're being hosted in AWS. And so actually, people have become now more comfortable receiving big, long URLs. I mean, if you share something in OneDrive these days and you look at the length of the URL, there's no way you can say that's phishing. It's impossible to determine. So we actually start to see more and more people clicking on links, and as a result of phishing simulation tests as well, you can see that it is actually ultimately increasing because that old advice of hover over and check the link is just not valid anymore. So yeah, so it is a tricky one. High volumes of messages, but a lot of them, granted, are getting blocked, but it's something that we do need to keep aware of.
How are you dealing with QR codes?
Good question. At the pre-delivery stage with QR codes, we'll extract any QR codes that we see within an email, whether that's directly in the email body, whether it's an attachment in a PDF, in a document, whatever it happens to be, assuming that we can extract that. At that point, we'll go off and then sandbox the message, go and scan the ultimate destination and work it out from there.
Is there a rise in those instances?
There has been. It seems to, certainly based on some of the data that I saw recently from the threat research team, we're suggesting it's tailed off a little bit, but ultimately off the back of COVID and everyone kind of getting comfortable with QR codes, it ultimately is there, yeah. But we've seen, it is an area actually we've introduced into our security awareness training to make people aware, because again, it's another sort of thing that we all trust it. We're comfortable with it now, so we're happy to scan a code. You probably go to webinars. There you go, it's on the badge. Yeah, absolutely, it's on the badge. You go to a webinar and it's contact details, just scan it and away you go. People just need to be aware you're doing the same as clicking on a link at that point. Cool.
Thank you very much.
All right, thank you.